This video was sponsored by Blinkist. So let's say you're an idealist that was recently inspired by the ideas of universal basic income, free healthcare, or completely opposite ideas like smaller limited government to let the free market do its thing. Whatever it is, you believe that if we just tried this out just for a little bit, it would work and lift tons of people out of poverty, stop crime, and bring prosperity to all. And for good reason. Experimenting with new ideas is what has led to every single new invention, innovation, and change that we take for granted today. So it only makes sense that we should experiment with how we govern over people, to experiment with the rules that we set for society. So you set out to put your plan into action to change the rules of the game. But then boom! You quickly run into the wall of slow, inefficient politicians and bureaucrats. Or in other words, you've run into the classic problem of monopolies. Except in this case, it's not a monopoly on oil, railroads, social media platforms, but a monopoly on the most important business, the business of governance. There aren't two US federal governments competing for your tax dollars, but only one that you're forced to pay or get thrown into prison. In fact, if we treat a government as an industry, it's by far the largest in the world, accounting for 30% of global GDP, and it's the industry that affects every single aspect of your life. Yes, you watching this video, your life, down to the thoughts you're allowed to think. And yet, it's the slowest industry in the world that's the most difficult to innovate in, where the poorest performers killed their own customers. We've had the agricultural revolution, the commercial and industrial revolution, and we're in the age of information right now. But why not a revolution in the most important arena? A governance revolution. The unlikely answer to sparking this new revolution? The sea. Enter seasteading, or floating cities on the sea where aquatic citizens live in modular pods that can detach and join other cities at any time. And since they would be in international waters, cities would be able to govern themselves. Where instead of you being forced to put up with your government, governments are forced to compete for citizens like companies compete for customers. Where instead of you trying to change the rules of a monopoly, if you like the laws of another floating city, you can easily leave and join that one. Where instead of debating and screaming at each other about political ideas like universal basic income or whatever, you can test them in real life against reality and let the better idea win. A Silicon Valley of governance, if you will.
Arguments don't change the world. Startups change the world.
Where instead of just leaving your livelihood behind when a storm hits the coastal city that you live in, we can take your city and... That idea may just be crazy enough to work. Maybe Patrick was right. Where seasteads, as we're calling it, are the hardware of society, and the rules or laws we choose are the software to create new societies. But wait, before you think this is some science fiction pipe dream, before you call this impossible, we already have cities and other giant structures on the sea. They're called cruise ships, Japan's many giant airport islands, container ships, Shell's floating natural gas facility that's longer than the Empire State Building, nuclear submarines, nuclear aircraft carriers that can stay at sea for 15 to 20 years before refueling, and many more examples. Everything about seasteading is counterintuitive, but solutions to the most difficult problems are always counterintuitive, otherwise we would have already thought of them by now. This is the race for the aquatic age. The basic idea around seasteads are rather simple, and as we mentioned before, almost all the technology needed to make this work already exists. It's just a matter of taking those technologies and putting them together. And at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of interchangeable floating modules that can connect together to allow humans to eat, sleep, work, and play on the ocean. Instead of roads, you maybe have little rivers to travel around in boats like in Miami or Venice. The floating platform can be built out of steel, concrete, or fiber composites like carbon fiber, all of which are already used in water-related projects, with each having their own pros and cons like how long they'll last, price, weight, etc. The bigger you build the platform, the more stable it is against waves, which provides the incentive to make ocean cities big. Once you have the platforms, you can build anything on top of it. Housing, offices, hotels, walkable green space, ports, power generators like how we already have floating solar fields and Shell's natural gas facility, and cruise ships are the perfect example of ocean cities. They have more amenities than the average town, you sign a contract before you board for their own medical and security staff, and since the business model and demand is there, it's not that expensive. Take this 18-night cruise that travels all over Europe, for example. An inside cabin will cost you $66 per day or around $2,000 per month, not including other expenses. And that's still 2 times cheaper than the average apartment in Manhattan while traveling all over Europe. If you want a cabin with a view, that will cost you around $100 a night or $3,000 per month, still cheaper than Manhattan. But Jake, that doesn't count. You can't live on a cruise ship forever. Or can you? Meet Mama Lee. Her and her husband fell in love with cruising, so when he passed away, his last words to Mama Lee were to never stop cruising. And that's what she's been doing for over a decade now with the break during quarantine and has been loving every single part of it. Or take Mario Saucedo for example, another full-time cruiser who's taken over 2,000 cruises in the last 20 years. Cruise ships are also already taking advantage of the fact that they operate in international waters like our ocean cities would. They register their ships in countries like Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands where there are less regulations, lower taxes, or the country doesn't have enough resources to enforce their regulations on these ships. Or in other words, cruise ships are already ahead of the game. Since they're seaborne, they already get to choose what governments they want to work with. And guess what? At one point, people probably thought cruise ships were impossible as well. As we mentioned before, there are many other examples of the coming aquatic age that we don't have time to go into detail with. Japan with their rugged terrain, high population density, and zoning issues forced them to expand their airports onto the ocean. The Dutch are conveniently nested between the world's largest sea gate holding back the North Sea and the snowmelt from the Alps. That's why they already have amphibious houses. What's the difference between North Korea and South Korea? They're on the same peninsula, they have access to the same resources, and when the North and South split back in 1948, most of the people from both nations came from the same families, with only an imaginary line separating the two, or a very real line in the case of the DMZ. And yet today, almost a century later, when you look at the area from above at night, you see South Korea, Japan, China gleaming with prosperity, and then there's the black hole of North Korea, where the rural areas are darker than some parts of the oceans. 25 million people living in complete darkness with food shortages, suffering, the whole 9 yards. Yet travel just a few miles south of that border and you see the happy citizens of South Korea enjoying all the fruits of a modern society. What is the difference between the two? Simple. The rules, the laws, how they govern over their subjects.
What are the rules?
Now you may be saying to yourself, but Jake, North Korea is a very special case. You can't come to this conclusion from just this one outlier. But what about the Dominican Republic versus Haiti? Similar situation, they share the same island and resources, yet the border between them can be clearly seen from space. Not because of a border wall or a river separating the two, but because the Dominican side is filled with forestry while the other side looks pretty much dead. Just like the Koreans, the only thing separating the two is the artificial lines humans made up and the rules that govern each side. Now maybe that example is a special case too, but when you consider all the other examples like East versus West Germany, Hong Kong the land of billionaires versus mainland China, Singapore versus Malaysia, Greece versus Albania, and you will see that the only distinction comes down to the rules.
What are the rules?
That is how powerful rules the laws of a society are. They determine how high you can climb, how prosperous you can be, how long you'll live on average, how happy you'll be on average, and the list goes on and on.
The World Bank figured this out 10 years ago. Exhaustive study determining what makes countries rich. The most valuable thing in the world is the rule of law you plant from which everything else sprouts.
So if rules are so important, how do we change them and how might Seasteads help? Well, since the agricultural revolution, all wealth and power came from those that were able to control land. Rulers, dictators, military leaders, often involving bloodshed. Power and wealth also came to those who were able to innovate on top of that land, building farms, businesses, etc. And in the early days, it used to be that once you discovered new land, you could set up a colony, try out your own set of rules, and see how it fares. That's the exact story of America. They discovered the new world, set up shop, and experimented with the crazy idea that power rested in the people, not the government. An idea that was so out of the realm of understanding at the time that everyone thought would fail that people in Europe referred to it as the American experiment. This experiment worked out so well that the radical idea of limited representative democracy is now the industry standard around the world. Today, there might well be the next American experiment waiting to be discovered. The problem is, there are no more new worlds to be discovered on this planet. One way we've gotten around this is with special economic zones, and it all started with Hong Kong. In short, Hong Kong was ruled by the British after World War II until they eventually gave it back to China in 1997. Because of the different rules the British had in Hong Kong compared to the planned economy in mainland China, Hong Kong's wealth skyrocketed during the second half of the 1900s.
And over the next 36 years, the wealth of the average person in Hong Kong, watch this slide, grew 87 times.
China was so impressed by Hong Kong that it created a bunch of other special economic zones all over the country. And the same things happened. Today, Hong Kong has the most expensive real estate in the world and has the second most billionaires in the world behind New York. Shenzhen, another special economic zone in China, has risen to the hardware capital of the world and is known as the most futuristic city as well. All because of, what do you know, a different set of rules.
So in 1979, when it was designated a special economic zone, Shenzhen didn't even have a traffic light. And this is what happened in 25 years. So today, Shenzhen manufactures 90% of computer keyboards, 90% of computer mice, and 90% of Shenzhen's population are migrant workers. At least 500 million people escaped extreme poverty as they migrated to these special economic zones.
But China isn't alone. Other countries have acted as special economic zones as well. Take Singapore, for example. Singapore also doesn't have many natural resources like Hong Kong besides their harbor. They have universal healthcare, yet the government makes more money than it spends. They follow typical English laws, yet they dish out death sentences over Zoom if you're caught with over 15 grams of heroin. And like China's special economic zones, Singapore went from half of the population being illiterate to one of the richest countries in Asia. Nordic countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are also kind of like special economic zones, except they take a very different approach. Instead of low taxes, low regulations, they have high personal taxes, very generous welfare services. Their people work some of the lowest amount of hours on the planet, and yet they're overall some of the most happiest people on the planet too. So what's the answer? More welfare or less government taxes and spending? The answer is we haven't had enough experiments to find out. You probably heard of Thomas Edison's quote about how it took him 10,000 tries to invent the light bulb. He was probably exaggerating, but the point remains. If it takes that many tries to invent a simple invention in retrospect, how can we ever hope to find the answer to the extremely complex question of how to organize millions of people, all with their own self-interest, problems, desires, when we only have 195 countries and a little over 500 special economic zones in the world? Only a little over 700 experiments running in the world, plus the fallen civilizations of the past. Now that may sound like a lot, but at this rate, we will never get to the answer to the most impactful business to mankind.
You don't discover the most miraculous societies by trying one Hong Kong here, one Singapore over there, or even 30 free zones in Dubai. You need thousands of startup societies exploring the future, discovering the best ways of governing ourselves. As long as people can join them voluntarily and leave them voluntarily, we will engage an evolutionary market process, and solutions will emerge that we can't imagine now.
We need more special economic zones. The problem with special economic zones is that they're too far and few between. Number one, there's no new land to colonize. You could take away more land from local populations by force, but that's probably not a good idea. Number two, it requires global superpowers like the US and China to relinquish more of their power to turn their existing land into special economic zones. And as we all know, once you get power, it's very hard to let go of it. And number three, special economic zones benefit from being in prime locations where a lot of trade can happen. All the special economic zones we talked about happen to all be touching the ocean as it turns out. So maybe there is something to the ocean. Singapore and Hong Kong won the real estate lottery. And if real estate is location, 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 what if you could choose your location instead of being content with the hand you were dealt? That is why we need seasteads, or special economic zone seasteads to be exact. Because floating cities are mobile, they can position themselves in the most profitable areas around the world. They would allow more of these experiments and governance to happen that skyrocketed places like Hong Kong to the stratosphere without trying to overhaul existing governments. And since people can choose which cities they join at any time, a government dissolving or not being effective wouldn't lead to war or people starving to death either. Seasteading isn't necessarily the answer to our most complex problems. The answer is more experiments in government. And until superpowers are willing to give up some of their power in a timely manner, until humans are able to move their homes and leave and join governments easier, or until the cost of creating space colonies goes way down, seasteading in international waters seems to be the path of least resistance. If you're gonna start your own floating city, you're gonna need a ton of knowledge. Everything from science, business, economics, politics, and everything in between. And it's so easy to make the excuse that you don't have time to read all these books. In fact, that's personally my main bottleneck right now, trying to make more time for reading. This is where Blinkist comes in. Blinkist takes the best, most popular nonfiction books and turns them into 15-minute discoveries that you can listen to during your commute, while you clean, etc. That way you can take back some of your wasted time and turn them into productive, easy moments for learning. They have a lot of my favorite books on there like The Lean Startup, Deep Work, and a lot of books that I've always wanted to read, but they just never became the #1 thing that I needed to learn at the time, so I never got to them. But now, I can go ham on all these books and read the full versions afterwards if I really like them. We live in the golden age of information. People in absolute poverty around the world would kill to know English to be able to take advantage of all this knowledge. And yet, if you ask yourself, are you really making the most of all this knowledge? Like myself, the answer is probably a hard no. That's why Blinkist is offering the first 100 people who sign up with the link below unlimited free access for a week to try it out and 25% off if you want the full membership afterwards. So you and I, we're gonna stop making excuses, we're gonna join the other 14 million people using Blinkist to make the most out of this beautiful time that we're living in, while supporting the brands that help make this channel possible too. Again, the first 100 people who click the link below will get free access for a week and 25% off if you want to join afterwards. Would you guys want to live on the sea? People already do it in like shipping containers and cruise ships and oil rigs, and I'm not sure my opinion on it, maybe. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I am definitely considering being a full-time cruiser though. That sounds pretty fun. Huge shout out to the Seasteading Institute and their president, Joe Quirk. They're the ones really spearheading this movement, and that's who you saw in all those clips. Highly recommend Joe's book on seasteading because I only got to cover like a small slither of all the information and benefits that are in that book. So yeah, that'll be linked below and I highly recommend. If you want more videos on this subject, like maybe like some updates or whatever, if they come up, just let me know in the comments below. If you're still watching this right now and you're new to this channel, you might as well subscribe because we make videos like this every single week for free that you can dislike and unsubscribe from whenever you want. So you might as well click that subscribe button because it really helps out a ton. If you want to support this channel financially, check out today's sponsor. If you want memes, behind the scenes stuff, day in the life kind of stuff, like sneak peeks on new videos and stuff, you can follow me on Instagram at jaketrend.io. That is gonna wrap it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really do mean that, by the way. You've been awesome. I've been Jake. I'll see you guys in the next one.